The forest was ancient, a sprawling expanse of towering pines and gnarled oaks that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the canopy above filtered the sunlight into a dim, greenish haze. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the soft crunch of underbrush underfoot. A lone figure moved through the trees, a ranger named Elias. He had been patrolling this remote wildlife sanctuary for years, but today felt different. The forest was quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, stirring the branches only faintly before falling still again. Elias paused, his boots sinking into the soft moss beneath him. He scanned the shadows, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Something was wrong. The first sign had been the birds. Earlier that morning he had noticed their absence. No sparrows flitted through the underbrush, no crows cawed from the treetops. The silence was unnerving, a void where life should have been. Then there were the tracks. Deep, heavy imprints in the mud near the riverbank. They were unlike anything Elias had seen before, too large to belong to a bear or a moose. The prints were wide and rounded, with a strange, almost webbed appearance. He had followed them for hours, his curiosity outweighing his unease, but now, as the light began to fade, he wondered if he had made a mistake. The forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening and merging into a single, oppressive gloom. Elias pressed on, his senses heightened. The air was cooler now, carrying a faint, briny smell that seemed out of place so far from the ocean. He frowned, his pulse quickening. The scent grew stronger as he approached a clearing, and when he finally stepped into the open, he froze. The clearing was vast, a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering trees. In the center lay a massive shape, partially obscured by the dim light. Elias approached cautiously, his breath shallow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into something impossible. A whale. It was enormous, its sleek, dark body glistening with moisture. Its flippers splayed awkwardly on the forest floor. Elias stared, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. How could a whale be here, miles from the nearest coast? The creature was alive, its sides rising and falling with labored breaths. Its eye, large and dark, fixed on Elias with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He took a step back, his heart pounding. The whale's presence was overwhelming, a surreal intrusion into the natural order of the forest. And yet, there was something else. A sound, faint but unmistakable. It was a low, resonant hum, vibrating through the air and the ground beneath his feet. The whale's song. The sound grew louder, filling the clearing with an eerie, otherworldly melody. Elias felt it in his chest, a deep, primal vibration that seemed to resonate with the very core of his being. The trees around him swayed, though there was no wind, and the ground trembled as if the earth itself were responding to the song. He dropped to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears, but the sound was inescapable. It was beautiful and terrifying, a symphony of longing and despair. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the song stopped. The forest fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Elias looked up, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. The whale's eye was still fixed on him, but now there was something different in its gaze. A recognition, a connection. It was as if the creature had been waiting for him, as if it had a message only he could understand. Before he could move, the ground beneath the whale began to shift. The earth cracked and groaned, and the massive creature started to sink, pulled down by some unseen force. Elias scrambled backward, his mind reeling. The whale's eye never left his, even as its body disappeared into the ground. The last thing he saw was the faint glimmer of its flipper before the earth closed over it, leaving the clearing eerily still. Elias sat there for what felt like hours, his body trembling, his mind racing. The forest around him seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating as if it had never been. The birds began to return, their calls tentative at first, then growing louder. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and carrying away the last traces of the briny scent. When Elias finally stood, his legs shaky, he knew he would never speak of what he had seen. The whale's song had been a secret, a moment of connection between two worlds that were never meant to intersect. He turned and walked away, the forest closing in behind him, and as he disappeared into the trees, the clearing remained empty, a silent testament to the mystery that had unfolded here. But deep beneath the earth, the whale's song continued, echoing through hidden caverns and ancient rivers, a reminder that the world was far stranger and more wondrous than anyone could imagine. And somewhere, in the heart of the forest, the earth still hummed with its melody, a secret kept by the trees and the shadows, waiting for the next soul brave enough to listen. Elias returned to his cabin that night, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and awe. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls, but the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The whale's song still echoed faintly in his memory, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. He couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't rationalize the presence of a whale in the heart of the forest, and yet he knew it had been real. The weight of the experience pressed on him, a burden and a gift all at once. The next morning, Elias woke to the sound of birdsong. The forest seemed to have returned to its usual rhythm, as if the previous day's events had been a dream. But the memory of the whale's eye, its gaze so full of meaning, lingered. He decided to return to the clearing, though he wasn't sure what he hoped to find. The rational part of him whispered that the whale was gone, swallowed by the earth, but another part, a deeper, more instinctive part, felt drawn back to the place where the boundaries of the world had seemed to blur. The journey to the clearing felt longer this time, the forest denser and more foreboding. The tracks he had followed the day before were still visible, though they seemed older now, as if years had passed instead of hours. When he finally reached the clearing, he stopped at the edge, his breath catching in his throat. The ground where the whale had lain was undisturbed, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. There was no sign of the cracks that had swallowed the creature, no indication that anything extraordinary had happened. Elias knelt, running his fingers over the earth, but it felt solid and unyielding. He closed his eyes, listening, but the forest was silent, except for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a raven. And then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, rising from the ground beneath him. It was the whale's song, muted and distant, but unmistakable. Elias pressed his ear to the earth, his heart pounding. The sound was coming from deep below, resonating through the layers of soil and rock. It was as if the forest itself had absorbed the song, carrying it through its roots and veins. Elias stayed there for hours, listening to the faint melody, feeling its vibrations in his chest. He didn't understand what it meant, but he knew it was important. The whale had come to this place for a reason, and its song was a message, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things, of the mysteries that lay beneath the surface of the world. As the sun began to set, Elias finally stood, his legs stiff and his mind clearer than it had been in years. He took one last look at the clearing, now bathed in the golden light of dusk, and turned to leave. The forest seemed to welcome him back, its shadows less menacing, its sounds more familiar. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the trees themselves were aware of him and the secret he now carried. Days turned into weeks, and Elias returned to his routine, patrolling the sanctuary and tending to its needs. But he was changed. He found himself listening more closely to the sounds of the forest, attuned to its rhythms and whispers. He noticed things he had overlooked before, the way the light filtered through the leaves, the patterns in the bark of the trees, the subtle shifts in the behavior of the animals. The forest had always been alive, but now it felt like a living, breathing entity, pulsing with a quiet, ancient energy. One evening, as Elias sat on the porch of his cabin, he heard it again, the whale's song. It was faint, carried on the wind from deep within the forest, but it was there. He stood, his heart racing, and stepped off the porch, following the sound. The forest seemed to guide him, its paths familiar yet somehow new. He walked until he reached a small, hidden glade where a stream trickled over smooth stones, and the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers. In the center of the glade stood a tree unlike any he had ever seen. Its trunk was twisted and gnarled, its branches reaching skyward like the arms of a supplicant, and at its base, half buried in the earth, was a smooth, dark stone that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. Elias approached cautiously, his breath shallow. As he drew closer, he realized the stone was not a stone at all. It was a fragment of the whale, a piece of its body transformed into something else. The song grew louder as he knelt beside it, the vibrations resonating through his body. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the fragment, and in that moment he understood. The whale had not come to the forest by accident. It had been drawn here, to this place, to deliver its song. A song that was not just a melody, but a message, a warning. The world was changing, and the forest, the earth, the very fabric of life was crying out. Elias stayed in the glade until the stars filled the sky, the fragment of the whale glowing softly in the moonlight. When he finally returned to his cabin, he knew his life would never be the same. The whale's song had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose and responsibility. He would protect this place, not just as a ranger, but as a guardian of the secrets it held. And so the forest remained, its mysteries hidden beneath the surface, its song carried on the wind. And Elias, the keeper of its secrets, listened, always listening, for the echoes of the whale's song and the whispers of the earth. Years passed, and Elias became a legend among the few who knew of him. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the ranger who lived deep in the sanctuary, a man who seemed to understand the forest in ways no one else could. They said he could predict storms before they came, find lost hikers by listening to the trees, and calm agitated animals with a single touch. But Elias himself remained a solitary figure, rarely seen and even more rarely spoken to. He had become a part of the forest, as much as the ancient oaks and the winding streams. The fragment of the whale which he had carefully buried beneath the twisted tree in the glade became a kind of shrine. Elias visited it often, especially when the weight of his solitude grew too heavy. The song, though faint, was always there, a constant reminder of the connection he had felt that day in the clearing. It grounded him, gave him purpose, and kept him attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. But as the years went by, the forest began to change. The signs were subtle at first, a shift in the migration patterns of birds, a thinning of the underbrush, a strange quiet that settled over certain areas. Elias noticed it all, his senses sharpened by years of living in harmony with the land. He tried to ignore the growing unease in his chest, but it was impossible. Something was wrong. One evening, as he sat by the fire in his cabin, the whale's song returned with a sudden, startling intensity. It was louder than it had been in years, the vibrations shaking the walls of the cabin and rattling the windows. Elias stood, his heart racing, and stepped outside. The forest was alive with sound, the creaking of trees, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a wolf. But beneath it all was the song, deep and resonant, rising from the earth itself. He followed it as he had done so many times before, his feet carrying him instinctively toward the glade. The air was thick with tension, the forest holding its breath as if waiting for something to happen. When he reached the glade, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The twisted tree was glowing, its bark shimmering with a faint silvery light. The ground around it was cracked and broken, as if something had risen from beneath the earth. And there, in the center of the glade, stood the whale. It was not the same creature he had seen all those years ago. This one was smaller, sleeker, its body shimmering with an otherworldly light. But its eye, large and dark, was the same, filled with the same intensity and recognition. Elias approached slowly, his heart pounding. The whale's song grew louder, filling the glade with its haunting melody. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, in the very core of his being. And then, as he drew closer, the whale began to change. Its body shimmered and shifted, its form dissolving into a swirling mist of light and sound. The mist enveloped Elias, and for a moment, he felt as if he were floating, weightless and timeless. Images flashed before his eyes, visions of the forest, the earth, the oceans. He saw the interconnectedness of all things, the delicate balance that held the world together. And he saw the cracks, the fractures that were spreading through that balance, threatening to tear it apart. The whale's song was a warning, a call to action, a plea to protect what remained. When the mist cleared, Elias was alone in the glade. The twisted tree stood silent and still, its light faded. The whale was gone, but its song lingered, echoing in his mind and heart. He knew what he had to do. In the days that followed, Elias began to reach out to the outside world for the first time in years. He contacted scientists, conservationists, and local leaders, sharing his knowledge of the forest and the changes he had observed. He spoke of the whale's song, though few believed him, and urged them to listen to the earth, to protect it before it was too late. Some dismissed him as a recluse, a man who had spent too long alone in the woods, but others listened, drawn by the urgency in his voice and the depth of his conviction. Slowly, a movement began to grow, a network of people dedicated to preserving the natural world and restoring its balance. Elias continued to live in the forest, his connection to it stronger than ever. He knew the fight would be long and difficult, but he also knew he was not alone. The whale's song had awakened something in others, just as it had in him, and together they would work to heal the earth. And in the quiet moments, when the forest was still and the stars filled the sky, Elias would visit the glade and listen. The song was always there, faint but enduring, a reminder of the mystery and wonder of the world. It was a song of hope, of resilience, of the unbreakable bond between all living things. And as long as it played, Elias would keep listening, keep fighting, and keep believing in the power of the whale's song. The years rolled on, and Elias grew older, his hair silvering and his steps slowing, but his resolve never wavered. The sanctuary he had once patrolled alone now buzzed with activity. Researchers set up stations to monitor the health of the forest, volunteers planted trees and cleared invasive species, and educators brought schoolchildren to learn about the delicate balance of nature. The movement Elias had sparked had grown into a global effort, with people from all walks of life joining hands to protect the planet. Yet, despite the progress, Elias could still feel the cracks in the earth, the fractures in the balance that the whale had shown him. The song, though faint, never left him, a constant hum in the back of his mind, a reminder of the work still to be done. One crisp autumn morning, Elias woke to a stillness that felt different. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. He stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold air, and listened. The usual sounds of the forest, The chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a fox were absent. Even the wind seemed to have paused. The only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the whale's song. But it was different now, sharper, more urgent. Elias followed the sound, his old bones protesting as he moved through the underbrush. The forest seemed to guide him, the trees parting slightly, the path clearer than it had ever been. He walked for hours, the song growing louder with each step, until he reached a part of the sanctuary he had never seen before. It was a small, hidden valley, surrounded by towering cliffs and filled with a strange golden light. In the center of the valley was a pool of water, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a mirror.